Welcome back. We missed you.
We did.
Yeah, and you are listening to We Could Talk About This podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Conversations with Jonathan and Christa Threlfall about ideas shaping us in the world we're living in.
Mm-hmm.
Today we're talking about a very big issue. It's something very important to the Christian faith.
Yeah.
The problem of evil.
Yes.
Jonathan, what is the problem of evil?
Problem of evil. It's not just a topic related to Christianity, but any worldview that has a deity, a good deity in it. And that is, how could a good God allow pain and suffering in the world? That's the problem of evil.
Yes. Yes, and you're right. It's not just a problem with opponents to Christianity.
Yeah.
But I think I've read that as people's opposition, or even heard that as like, I just can't believe in a God who would allow so much evil in the world.
Yeah. In fact, I finished reading Luc Ferry's book. He's a French philosopher. Is a brief history of philosophy, a guide to, I forget the subtitle, is a guide to wise living or something like that. But when he describes Christianity as being not a philosophy, but an approach to life that gives you victory over the fear of death by actually conquering death, he gives as its two reasons why he can't accept it. Number one, it's too good to be true. And number two, the God of Christianity simply couldn't exist because of the problem of evil.
Yeah.
So for him, the problem of unjust suffering, the torture of children, the kinds of horrendous, despicable evil that humans have inflicted on one another is God really superintending over all this? He's just saying, I can't countenance that.
Yeah.
While the idea of a bodily resurrection and an eternity of bliss is incredibly appealing to him, too good to be true, plus the downside of the problem of evil. So yeah, it is a legitimately big issue, a stumbling block for many people when thinking through the coherence of the Christian worldview.
Yeah. Yeah, and so what's our flow here?
Well, we'll talk about different ways the problem of evil has been formulated and then responses to it, because there are two main ways in which the problem of evil hits us. There's the intellectual issue, and that is whether Christianity is coherent. That is, do the individual propositions that make up the Christian worldview, do they fit together, or do they conflict with one another? If they conflict with one another, I can't believe it.
Yeah.
And then there's the existential problem, which confronts people who are actually suffering. I'm feeling pain right now. Whatever the intellectual arguments for or against the existence of God are less relevant to me right now than the fact that I just lost a child, or I have a terminal illness, or I have had loved ones tortured to death. Those kinds of things that people have actually experienced.
Yes. Yes, and we were talking about this before, that it's everyone deals with both of those.
Right.
Everyone experiences suffering to some degree, and then has to make sense of that in their mind. So it's never only an intellectual crisis.
Right.
Or
I guess for some, for a moment when they're separating themselves from their suffring and they're just working it out on paper, which some people do that.
Yeah.
They will try to be as objective and rational as they can about it. And they would say, even if I'm not a sufferer, I would look at what I see to be the suffering in the world and say, that counts as evidence against the kind of God that's described in the Bible.
Yep. Yeah.
So so anyway, what I'm doing is distinguishing the two kinds of problems as they are either rational, intellectual, or on the other hand, an existential. On the one hand, I don't see coherence among these propositions. On the other hand, I'm feeling suffering, feeling pain myself.
Yes.
Yeah.
So do you want to answer the intellectual argument first?
Yeah, I think let's deal with that first. So the first thing to recognize about the intellectual argument, or the intellectual problem of evil, is that you don't have a problem with evil unless you're first assuming the existence of the Christian God, or at least a God that is benevolent and omnipotent. And the reason why is because on what other grounds do you have to call someone evil? Something evil.
Yeah.
So if you were to say, well, I've read this example in some textbooks on ethics. A baby deer, a fawn, gets caught in a wildfire and burns to death. That just seems really sad, right? It's painful. It just seems really sad. God let that happen according like that seems wrong. Okay, you can say, although that seems really sad and bad, is that really going to tip the scales for you against the existence of God? Maybe not. Well, let's scale it up a little bit then. Let's talk about genocide. Let's talk about some of these atrocities that have happened in the last century in Africa, in Europe. Okay, is you're saying you have a problem with the existence of God because he allowed that to happen? But I would say, well, upon what grounds do you call that wrong? I'm not saying it's not wrong. I'm just saying that unless you're first of all assuming a being, or at least a transcendent principle of right and wrong, you can't call that evil.
Right. Like, what's the foundation that you're basing that question
That's on? Right. Yeah. I would push it back on the person. According to your worldview, what is evil?
Right. And where are you getting that worldview from?
Yeah. And what gives you the right to call something evil and something good, unless you're presupposing some transcendent. By transcendent, I mean beyond this physical material universe.
Yeah.
And if that's all you're willing to believe in, you're completely atheistic, then you also have no room. There's no objection. There's no way around this. You have no room for calling something morally evil. You can say, I'm hurting. You can say, this feels painful.
Yeah.
But you cannot say, this is wrong.
Right.
So I guess the reason why evil is a problem, it's only a problem within the Christian worldview. So that would be something that I would.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Wouldn't there be other worldviews, not Christian?
Right.
So that would say, that have evil in it.
Well, yes, I would say, though they're not a problem as much as they are for the Christian worldview.
Okay.
I would include Islam and Judaism in that.
Okay.
The three monotheistic religions.
Okay.
Because they claim that God is both omnipotent and omnibenevolent. But other philosophies, you could barely call them religions, Shintoism, Confucianism, Buddhism, Hinduism, they approach a more pantheistic view of things, where there is.
Can you just define those two words, monotheism?
Yeah, monotheism, you believe that there's only one God.
And then pantheism.
And pantheism, where you believe that everything is God and God is everything. And so if that's the case, then everything that exists is virtually the same as God, and you can't really distinguish anything that's good and evil. And this filters down into their worldview too. So, a really hardcore Stoic or Buddhist would say there is no good and evil, there just is. Right? Yeah. And so accept it for what it is. That's your path to living well in this world. And so even within those worldviews, they have a hard time sorting out good and evil. So does that make sense? That's what
makes sense. And I was just going to say, aren't there hints of Stoicism in that, or no?
Definitely. Yeah. Well, there are. Again, I just finished reading this book by Luc Ferry, which he draws a very close connection between Stoicism and Buddhism in their guidance for what it means to live a wise life. That is, accept everything that comes to you as inevitable. Don't hope for a better future. Don't regret a past. Don't live in fear or guilt. And those are two things that correspond to the future or the past. Yeah. Just in the moment, what is all that's important. And that ties in with their worldview too, as to what the universe is and all that.
So we talked about like the whole question of the issue of the problem of evil. It's based on Christian foundation.
It arises within. Okay, so to get more specific, then the problem it's really hard for me to accept someone who rejects the existence of God based on the problem of evil, because you don't have a problem of evil unless God exists, unless you're assuming God exists.
Yes.
Make sense? Okay.
Yes.
But then that doesn't get around the fact that there is a problem here. Okay, what's the problem? Well, the problem usually is formulated in terms of a discrepancy or a conflict among three statements, three propositions that Christians would all hold to. One, God is all powerful. Two, God is all good. And three, evil exists. So you can't really live as a Christian in this world without affirming all three. Yes. You can't deny the reality of evil. Otherwise, why did Why does anything matter? Why did Jesus go and die on the cross if not for evil? You can't deny the fact that God is all good, because that would be to impugn his character. And you can't deny that he's all powerful, because otherwise he wouldn't be God. If there's anything more powerful than God, that would be God, right?
Right.
So then the question arises, why would an all good, all powerful God allow evil? That's the problem.
Yeah. And so are you going to answer that from an intellectual
Well,
point of view?
yeah, from the intellectual point of view, I would say it's a problem. And your point is, like, where do you go from that? And so God doesn't exist? Well, that doesn't follow from that. It just means that there's tension in the Christian worldview, and by tension, I don't mean something irreconcilable. I mean something probably that we don't understand. And I would also push that even further and say, for you to attempt to make the argument that there is no God because there is an apparent incompatibility between God's omnipotence, his omnibenevolence, and the existence of evil, you'd have to assume that you know for certain that there are no good reasons why an all good, all powerful God would permit evil. And you have to be able to quantify how much evil would have to be present in order for God to be unjustified or unwarranted in allowing it. So immediately, by trying to make that argument, a person gets themselves mired down in all kinds of questions they can't answer.
Yeah.
By evil, what do you mean? How much? Is it Bambi dying in a forest fire? Is it children being slaughtered along with this genocide? Is it a tsunami wiping out thousands of people? And at what point can you say for certain that God had no reason for allowing such things? So the fact that evil is a problem with in a worldview, in the Christian worldview, remains, but the accusation that unravels the Christian worldview doesn't stand.
Yeah. Okay, so how about existentially?
Okay.
I'm experiencing suffering.
Which this is probably the real issue, and a lot more pertinent, I think.
Yeah. I could like see someone listening to this and being like, "You're not speaking to me."
Yeah.
Like everything you just said, I don't care about, even though they probably do.
Yeah.
But they're suffering.
Okay.
And so
let me push back on that just a moment.
Okay.
Because I realize that we'll talk about the existential thing just a moment, but I think that it does matter to people, because this conversation reveals people's worldview. I think it can help people think, well, what do I think justifies good and evil?
Yes.
Right? I think there's value in that.
I agree.
Right.
I agree. I just think that sometimes people are suffering so much that to hear something explained, like, okay, well, that's based on your worldview, and it can be like, well, do you even care?
This is what I just said is absolutely not a counseling technique.
Yes.
It's absolutely not a way to counsel people and help through their suffering. Absolutely not.
Right.
It is, but what it does answer is plenty of textbook cases of objections against the Christian worldview based on evil. But when it comes to the existential problem of evil, I think, to your point, you have to answer that question on the level of it's being asked.
Right.
I'm suffering right now. You're a Christian. What are you going to do about that?
Yeah.
And I think that's where the Bible, and this is what I love most. Well, I don't love dealing in the intellectual objection of part of it, but I think that's where the Bible answers it so well, because the Bible tells a story about how humans plunge themselves into misery because of their wrenching themselves away from the life of God, who is the source of all joy and happiness and goodness. So to some degree, the problem of evil is wound up with the problem of our guilt and sinfulness. I'm not saying, and I think we need to be careful to point out, that doesn't mean that your suffering is because of something specific you did.
Right.
But I'm just saying it's the reality of living in a world that is absent of God's full presence and life-giving presence, right? But the Bible tells the story of how people suffered and sought answers and found not answers, but a person. And that's why the personal problem of evil is answered not by propositions, but by a person. So I'm a
person who was the answer.
A person who is the answer.
Right.
So I think a good a good place to go for this is the book of Job. Like, this is the ultimate book that deals with the problem of suffering in the Bible, not the intellectual problem of suffering, because Job, his issues weren't intellectual as much as they were personal. So near the end of Job in verse 42, after being confronted with God's power, God didn't give him an answer. Job wanted to put God on the defense and say, God, you tell me why you're doing this to me. And God says, no, I'm going to ask the questions.
Yeah.
What do you know about how I created this world? What do you know about all these things? And so finally, Job, humbled, says, I had heard you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you.
Mm.
I think the difference there is Job had a personal encounter with God in which it mattered less to him that he get all his questions answered and more to him that he was experiencing God himself.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that points to Jesus, who is God in the flesh. So this, to dip back into the intellectual problem, this omnibenevolent, omnipotent God suffered and died and rose again. And as such, he can identify fully with humans in their suffering.
Mm-hmm.
He is a man of suffering and acquainted with grief.
Right.
And so the problem of evil is not solved by giving it's not a syllogism to be worked out, but it's a savior.
Mm-hmm.
He is a savior who comes, suffers in our place, solves the problem of our personal sin, so that we can have a full and final eternal relationship with him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The problem of evil solved by Emmanuel.
Yes.
God with us.
Yes.
Who came to live as a human and experienced all of the temptations to the fullest degree, that all the suffering to the fullest degree, yet without sin.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's why in talking about this problem, we must point to Jesus. We must point to the fact that Jesus suffered and he died. He was and I don't want to say this in a demeaning way as if he had any lack of power, but he became a victim of unjust suffering.
Mm-hmm.
He was nailed to a cross.
Mm-hmm.
He did not deserve it. He was sinless. And what he was doing was taking our guilt upon himself. The reason why I love this so much too is because the true problem of suffering, like you're saying, is never merely intellectual. It's always personal. But that's exactly what God gives us in the resolution and the solution to it. So, like I was talking with someone recently who is really struggling with suffering that she's experienced. And she said that often she is extremely angry at God. And the solution for her is not to say, well, let me tell you why God allows evil, and there's the fallen world theodicy and there's the free will theodicy, all these kinds of things. That's not the thing. But like I need to point her to Christ, who is with her. Like that's the ultimate solution to it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it is important too, when you're engaging with other people on this problem, to really listen to them carefully and to hear what they're saying and how they're saying it. I remember talking with an older lady who had tragically lost a granddaughter, and we had just met a few weeks prior, and she knew I was a Christian, and she expressed this problem of evil, and she didn't say, I'm struggling with the problem of evil, but that's what she was expressing. And I remember I wanted to talk with her about Jesus, but in that moment, I just sat with her and I said, I'm so sorry. That is heartbreaking. And God gave me an opportunity the next week to be able to talk with her more about Jesus and how he came and experienced suffering to the fullest degree. But sometimes the best thing to do is not to start preaching or start expounding on things, but to be with someone in their pain and to let them know that you care and listening.
I think even in being with them in their pain, your sermon has begun incarnated by being what Jesus was to us in our pain.
Right.
And I think that's why we can do that, because that's what Jesus did.
Right. And I think too, like that is something where you have to walk by the Spirit and just be careful and prayerful
Yeah.
about that, because I remember sitting there and feeling this tension of like,
wanting to say something.
I know what she needs. She needs Christ. She needs to hear about Christ, but she already had some sense of religion and not being loved in that.
Yeah.
So anyway,
that's one thing I appreciate about you often emphasize the importance of following the leading of the Spirit. I think the question is, do I need to tell this person about Jesus before I show them Jesus, or do I show them Jesus and tell them about Jesus? Like, it requires wisdom to know what to do first and how long to do what. But following the prompting of the Holy Spirit, and being a good listener, being a good friend, but knowing what the truth and who the truth is incredibly important when helping people that are struggling with that problem, with the deep problem of suffering. And the other thing too, and I'm just alluding to this lady that I was talking about, who is really struggling with the suffering that she's experienced, is that even though she right now feels a lot of anger, at least her anger is directed toward in the right way. Like, at least the question that I would ask people is, where else are you going to go? Are you going to go away from God and turn away from the one who's extending himself toward you? Even though you don't understand why God will allow this, the knowing that God has come in the flesh and suffered for you, that's the ultimate invitation to come and to trust.
Yeah.
So that's why I think, again, Jesus and in his suffering doesn't supply answers to our questions, but it's even better than that. He is with us in our suffering.
Yeah, that's really good. I think even approaching this Christmas season, and it is a time where we think about Jesus coming to live as a human.
Yeah.
Just the hope that gives.
Yeah.
He came to enter into this world that he created.
Yeah.
To live as one of us, to take all our sin and suffering on him.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's something very humbling about suffering. That's what Job experienced. He was humbled, and sometimes, while we don't know all the reason, God uses suffering to get our attention. C.S. Lewis had said, "Pain is God's megaphone."
Right.
To wake up, a world that is often deaf to him. And I think he says he whispers to us in our pleasures, but shouts to us in our pain. And often that has been the prompting for people to come to Christ, and to, instead of turning away from God, to see, oh, God is not a distant deity, nor is he the pantheistic God, if you want to call it that, of the Stoics or the some of the Eastern religions, but he is a God who came and who is here, and he suffered, and he died for me because he loves me. That's life-changing. And that's also gives us hope in our suffering.
Yes. The psalmist said, "The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit."
Yes.
And it is often when we're in pain that we can feel the Lord's nearness to us too, because I think sometimes it's because we're like really alert and looking for that.
Yeah.
And that's often when God can grow people who are already trusting in him. He can deepen their faith through that time of suffering, and when God can use suffering to help people turn to him for faith for the first time.
Yeah, that's good. Hopefully this is helpful for you, whether you're suffering and experiencing the problem of suffering as a suffering person, or whether it is a intellectual curiosity for you. The ultimate answer, of course, is found in the person of Jesus Christ, and we hope that you do trust him. And hopefully you found this helpful, and we will post resources at wecoulddtalkaboutthispodcast.com. Thank you for joining us.